This is How I Wrote Burning Girls, and I'm Veronica Shanis. The title is a little bit misleading, I have to admit, insofar as I'm not actually going to talk about how I wrote Burning Girls, the novella. I am going to talk about how I wrote the two new stories in Burning Girls and Other Stories. Um, Emma Goldman Takes Tea with the Baba Yaga and The Revenant. And I'm doing this because while The Burning Girls, the novella, is a long and complicated saga of writing. In fact, it took me 8 years to write it. It was longer ago than the two most recent stories, and I think that I may not necessarily be telling a new and exciting story when I talk about how I wrote it. But the other two are, of course, fresh and exciting, and how I wrote them will be top of my mind. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Emma Goldman Takes Tea with the Baba Yaga. Let me turn this so you're not staring straight into the sun. Which is a phrase that popped into my mind years ago, and I never sort of really knew what to do with until I was reading a biography of Emma Goldman, as you know, one does for pleasure. And it was called Emma Goldman in Exile, and it was about Goldman's life after the US had deported her to the Soviet Union. And it turned out when she got to the Soviet Union, she went through this period of being completely unable to function in the way that she had for decades. And there were a number of things feeding into this. The Soviet Revolution was a disappointment is an understatement, but had betrayed, the Soviet government had betrayed the ideals of the revolution that Goldman had spent her life believing in and fighting for, that her anarchist comrades had fought for alongside the Bolsheviks. And of course, the Bolsheviks were not grateful. They imprisoned and executed a number of anarchists. But there were also personal things going on. Obviously, she had been deported. She lived in the United States since she was a teenager. And she was cut off from the people that she knew. Her older sister, Helena, who had raised her, more or less, in the place of a mother who, while there, was not emotionally present, died soon after she arrived in the Soviet Union. And she didn't receive that news for months because the letter was sent to St. Petersburg. She was in Moscow, and they didn't forward the letter for a couple months because her guide said, well, what could be happening in the United States that could compare to seeing the important revolutionary work taking place in the Soviet Union? Well, what could happen was that Helena had died. And Goldman went through a period of inaction, right, where she was constantly being asked by various Soviet institutions and agencies to work with them. And she was always finding a reason why she couldn't. She didn't like being supervised by the Bolshevik Party. She didn't like the inequities and injustices she saw in terms of, for instance, medical care, in which excellent medical care was being given to party members, while other people were, of course, receiving little to none. She didn't like what seemed to be a dehumanizing of priorities, in which, for instance, she ran into a woman who was expecting a baby and was very excited and talking about baby clothing, like you do. And the woman said, well, we leave that to the bourgeois women in the West. We've got more important things to talk about here. And Goldman sort of thought to herself, but what could be more important than clothing a baby? I happen to agree with her. So she turned down offer after offer, and in this book I was reading, Emma Goldman in Exile, the writer wrote, well, surely she could have put her nursing skills to use without feeling like she was betraying her ideals. What was going on? And it was very clear to me that what was going on was that Goldman was deeply depressed for all these political and personal reasons. There's no reason not to be, for her not to be depressed. And as somebody who has always deeply admired Goldman, identified with her in ways that mean I will never be able to measure up because I am simply too bourgeois to measure up, and I'm fully aware of that. But who also suffers from intense periods of depression and dysthymia that go on for years if I'm not properly medicated. I felt a deep kinship to that and wanted to explore what it meant to Goldman at that point to be in exile, to be in a context in which her dreams were shattering, her lifelong goals seemed to be falling short. And she was back home in what she'd always considered her motherland, but of course everything was different, right? When you go away for decades, you don't come home to the same place that existed when you left. And I wanted to juxtapose that with what it would mean to be older, right? What it means to be older, and to still be trying to fight the good fight. And so this is the setting, the context in which I wrote the first part, the historical section of Emma Goldman Takes Tea with the Baba Yaga. And the second section is not history. The second section is the fantasy, the fantastic part, where she meets the witch of the forest, the witch of the woods, the witch of the kingdom beyond the thrice nine kingdoms. And the witch makes her an offer, right, and says, yes, you are depressed, and you are depressed for good reason. And here's my offer to you. This world is a massive disappointment. Withdraw. Right? And I think that for those of us who suffer from depression, that is always the temptation, whether it is a very literal withdrawal in terms of suicidal ideation or action, or whether it's simply what happens when you're depressed and you cannot function in society, and you withdraw from the people who love you, you withdraw from the work that you love, and you find yourself in a smaller and smaller world. Until the world shrinks down to the size of your bedroom, perhaps. And that's the offer Baba Yaga makes to Emma Goldman. Withdraw. Withdraw from this world. It's an incredibly disappointing world. You have no one you love who keeps you there anymore at this point. You can say goodbye to all of them. Helena is gone. Alexander Berkman, Goldman's longtime best friend and companion, once lover, prefers younger women. Just withdraw, become a witch, live in the forest, mind your own business, and don't deal with these people and their disappointing habits any longer. And I wanted to juxtapose that to Goldman's deep love and belief in human potential. That those two things are in competition, right? The disappointment, the depression that says withdraw, forget about it, none of it is worth it. And the ideals and passion that had sustained her for so long, which said, no, humanity is worth it, right? We have the potential to live in an abundance of love and happiness, and we can make that happen. The third part of the story is a more personal reminiscence, and it's about what it means to me to look back at the way I was brought up and put that next to what I know now of the Russian Revolution. And I was brought up, my parents were Marxists. My father still is a Marxist. My mother is a unaffiliated leftist, which is how I think of myself. But she was a Marxist back then. And I was brought up to believe, more or less, that the Russian Revolution was the greatest event in human history. And yet, right? How did this play out in terms of what the Soviet Union had become? And so much of the rhetoric and ideology around it was that Stalin had perverted the Soviet Union. But when I went back as a teenager, and then again a few years ago, as I was writing this story, to reread Goldman's account of the Soviet Union and the critique she launched at it from the left, right? And I think that's often the mistake that leftists at the time make, to assume that all critiques of the Soviet Union came from the right, when indeed that was not the case, right? Anarchists, other leftists were criticizing the Soviet Union for its failure to live up to left ideals. And trying to reconcile those two things. What did it mean? Why did my parents buy into the Bolshevik Revolution, given what it had become, right? And how could I think about my upbringing in a way that I could retain the ideals I had been taught and have a clear-eyed view of what they had been turned into when people had tried to enact them. And I think in some ways it's not unlike what people go through when they are brought up in a religious tradition that they then find has a sordid and violent history. Um, I wouldn't know for certain, having been brought up an atheist, but I think that that's probably a similar dynamic. And I talked to my mother, and interestingly, I told her an anecdote from one of Goldman's accounts of being in the Soviet Union with Berkman. And Berkman said to the apparatchik who was showing him around, he remarked upon the number of child beggars begging for food on the streets of Moscow. And the apparatchik said defensively, no more than there are in London, which was what my mother said when I told her this story. She interrupted at that moment and said, well, there were no more than there were in London or New York. And I said, well, as Berkman said to the apparatchik, yes, but comrade, in Moscow the revolution has already come. And that was the point, right? What was the point of this revolution if you were going to have as many starving children after it as you had before it? What was the point? And I talked to my mother about this as I was writing this story, and I put some of that conversation into this story when she said we all should have known after Kronstadt, which was a sort of spontaneous uprising during the Russian Civil War of Russian peasantry who did not feel that their rights were being respected under the new regime, and how harshly it was put down by Trotsky. So we all should have known after Kronstadt. Of course, Kronstadt was in the early 20s. I was born in the 70s. My parents had every reason to know. There was no before Kronstadt when it came to my parents in the way I was brought up. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave us if the ideals are perverted? And that's sort of where I end the story. I wrote the story during Trump's regime, in the rise of the fascist right in the United States, which I still feel is a deep threat, that if steps are not taken to curb the voting restrictions that are being put in place state by state by the right wing, we will not have a democracy. We will not have even the semblance of a democracy anymore, and all kinds of vile restrictions and policies will be passed that if they're not already being enacted. And so I end this story on a very pessimistic note. I end this story thinking about the end of Goldman's life, the disappointments she had seen, and her ability to keep the faith, to keep the leftist, to keep the anarchist faith, and my lack of ability to do the same. It's very much a story about my inability to live up to the great love that Goldman had for humanity and her belief in human potential. And so it's a very bleak story in the end. And that's how I wrote it. So if that doesn't make you want to go out and buy the book and read it all up, I don't know what would. The next story I want to talk about, the other news story in the book, is called The Revenant. And that's a much more personal story. And it's in fact probably the most personal story I've ever written. The protagonist, the narrator, is very much me, more so than my narrators usually are. My protagonists are often versions of me, or idealized versions of me, or what I want to be, aspirational versions of me. This is very much me and my experiences as a teenager, and as a younger and then middle-aged woman in my life. And it's about the damage, the personal damage, the interpersonal damage that can be done by patriarchal sexual exploitation of young women. And I wrote this story in two very separate states. I wrote the second person aspect of it. It's a story that's told in a number of different ways. Let me just find it here so I can take a look at it. Page 255. So it's a story that's told in a number of different ways, in third person, in first person, and in second person. And I wrote the second person sections many years ago now. I say many. It feels recent, but it was about 10 years ago now that I wrote the second person sections, as I was trying to make sense of the way my romantic past was affecting my ability or lack thereof to have relationships in the present. And I wrote those second person sections. I wrote a couple first person sections about myself as a teenager, and there didn't seem to be a plot. I didn't know what to do with it. And I knew I liked the writing, and I knew it was getting at something important for me emotionally, but something wasn't gelling. So I put it away. And, I was dealing with a broken heart at the time, as so many of us do from time to time. I put it away. I'd work on something else. And then a couple years ago, I wanted to write, when I wanted to write a couple of news stories for Burning Girls, I took it out again and looked at it, and I thought, okay, I know what to do now. I can work with this. And I wrote the other sections, the first person and the third person. And I thought, this is really a story about what you do with a traumatic past. Right? And it's partially a fantasy about what you want to do with a traumatic past. And in that sense, it's a revenge story. Right? I thought about what it means to be a teenage girl, and how many superstitions and rituals and occult rituals are developed around teenage girls, and how easily they are dismissed, as many things that teenage girls care about are. Right? So light as a feather, stiff as a board. We all remember the movie The Craft, right? But also I thought about Bloody Mary. And I had run into reading a folklore essay about Bloody Mary years ago when I was working on my dissertation. I was working on a chapter of my dissertation about mirrors and representations of mirrors. For those of you who don't know, maybe you were never a teenage girl, it happens. Bloody Mary is supposed to, or sometimes Mary Worth, there's all kinds of names, is supposed to be a figure in the mirror, right? You turn off the lights and bring a lit candle into the bathroom where the mirror is, and you repeat Bloody Mary 3 times, or Mary Worth, or whatever ritual you're supposed to be, and Bloody Mary comes out of the mirror and scratches your eyes out and wreaks terrible, violent havoc. Why anybody would want to do this is, of course, one of the driving questions of the story. And the article I read was by Alan Dundes, a venerable and very important folklore scholar who nonetheless tended to read things in very Freudian terms. He felt the salient, and the really interesting thing about the Bloody Mary story for folklorists is that it arose in the United States in the 70s, seemingly across the country, with no real origin point. It just sprang up, right? And Dundes writes a sort of very Freudian take about how, since it's in the bathroom and it has to do with blood, it's clearly about menarche and getting your period, and it's about teenage girls' ambivalence about sexuality, which rang to me untrue, speaking as somebody who had been a teenage girl. That menarche was not connected to my ambivalence about sexuality as a teenager. But maybe it is connected to ambivalence about sexuality for sure. Maybe. For sure, maybe. You know what I mean. But what is it that makes sexuality such a site of ambivalence and difficulty for teenage girls? Why is it not an unambiguous positive thing? And then I went back to my own experiences, and of course it was not unambiguously positive at all. In retrospect, I'm not sure it was even slightly positive. It is an entry into, or can be, especially for, I think, young women, girls who are interested in young men or older men, as the case may be. It can be a site of exploitation, of cruelty, even of violence, right? But also a site that determines your worth in a patriarchal society. So of course there's an immense amount of ambivalence, at least ambivalence, right? And where Dundee's saw the blood as the blood of menarche and coming of age, I thought that's not what Bloody Mary is doing. She's not out there getting her period. She's scratching your eyes out. She's killing people. This is not about menarche. This is about rage. And this is about the fact that teenage girls are not allowed to express rage and be taken seriously, right? I mean, nothing teenage girls do gets taken seriously. But certainly, and I'm thinking mainly about white teenage girls because that's my experience. But certainly, if you're a white teenage girl, your rage is dismissed. I think probably if you are a black teenage girl, your rage makes you into a threat to white society that then is an excuse to mistreat you even further. But I have no experience of that, and I don't want to talk out of turn on it, so I'm going to stick to what I know here. I thought this is about rage. This is about rage and violence and wanting to take your own back, right? Wanting to get back your own sense of power that can be lost in the entrance into adult sexuality when you're a teenage girl. And so I put those two things together. In the first version of the story, I brought it to Ellen Datlow, and she said, the spec element doesn't enter into about halfway through the story. And I said, okay, I can fix that. So I did. I rearranged some sections. I moved Bloody Mary to the beginning. No problem there. And then I did what I wanted her to do, which was to enter into a revenge fantasy, where Bloody Mary comes out of the mirror, and instead of attacking the girl who has called her, which I think is a part of the story that is a very part of the Bloody Mary story that is very telling about where teenage girls are allowed to direct their rage, right? Freud said depression was rage turned inward, right? And so if you look at where white teenage girls are allowed to direct their anger and violence and rage, it's on themselves. So I decided, okay, well, the hell with that. Let's direct it where it belongs. Let's send the anger back to the person who deserves it. And so I have her come out of the mirror and stalk and kill a representation of the older man who done me wrong when I was younger. And why now, right? That was one of the questions Ellen Datlow raised when she read an early version of this story, given that by your timeline, it's been 20 years, maybe 25. Why kill an old man now? And the answer is that rage doesn't go anywhere, right? You spend years when you've been traumatized in this particular way, blaming yourself and feeling intense shame. At least I did, right? It was my fault. I should have known better. I acted poorly. I felt nothing but shame for many, many years. It wasn't until I was able to work through all that, years of therapy, and talking to my friends and still feeling the shame and working through all that, that I realized that no, I don't have to feel shame. What I feel is anger. What I feel is rage. It's never resolved, and so it never goes anywhere. So I brought Bloody Mary out of the mirror and sent her after this now older man. He was always older than me, but now this old man. And she kills him. And I got to that part of the story as I was writing it. Sorry. And I thought, okay, what now? Because it didn't feel as climactic. It didn't feel as cathartic as I wanted it to feel. What now? And I think that's the question the story ends on. You've gotten your revenge, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm in favor of a good revenge. I mean, anyone who's read Among the Thorns knows that I'm not opposed to bloody revenge. particularly in fantasy when the circumstances warrant it. Then what? Right? Are you better? Are you healed now? Can you move on with your life as though you had never been harmed? And I think the story doesn't know the answer because I don't know the answer. And that's how I wrote The Revenant. It's about a piece of yourself coming back from the past, a piece of yourself coming out of the mirror, a piece of yourself that no longer exists and no longer belongs in the world you're in now, coming back out of time, out of place, in order to, in some way, take care of you. Take care of you by hurting the people who hurt you. Take care of you by expressing the rage you were never able to express, at least not at the source of that rage. And then what happens when that piece of yourself fulfills its function? What's left for it? What's left for you? And that's the question that story ends on. So you'll have noticed that both these stories are a little bleak. And I've noticed that about my own writing. I don't think of myself as a terribly bleak person, at least not when I'm on my meds. And yet my writing tends to be very bleak. There are very few happy endings in my stories. I'm trying to think. There's a happy ending in Ballroom Blitz, and there's a happy ending in Among the Thorns. And then there's sort of bittersweet. There's a happy ending in Swimming. There's bittersweet endings in the others. I don't have an answer for that, except perhaps I see the world through a bleak lens. I don't know. I've got a few more minutes, so what I'm going to do is close out by just talking about the first story I wrote that's in this collection, called How to Bring Someone Back from the Dead. And that's a story I wrote so many years ago now. And I wrote it specifically shortly after my late best friend died, Jenna Felice. That's the woman to whom the book is dedicated. You can see it right there, For Jenna A. Felice, 1976 to 2001. She was an editor, a science fiction fantasy editor at Tor. We'd been best friends since high school. And she died suddenly and unexpectedly from a combination of her asthma being set off by an allergic attack. It was terrible. At the time I wrote this story, I was discovering my great love of fairy tales, of contemporary fairy tales. I was taking a course in fairy tales in graduate school. And I had not entered graduate school knowing that I wanted to work on fairy tales, which is what I work on as an academic, and clearly what I write a lot of. I didn't know that yet. I was working on Shakespeare at the time, but I took this fairy tale course because my favorite professor was taking it, and I thought, like, let's have some fun. And as I was taking this course, I was reading the fairy tales, and I was reading the contemporary fairy tales, and I was thinking about classical myth that I know, and thinking about pre-classical myth like Gilgamesh, and thinking about how for so long, for so many hundreds, thousands of years, human beings have been telling stories about the fantasy that if you love someone enough, you can bring them back from the dead, that if you love someone enough, you can beat death. And how what seemed to me to be a salient and important distinction was that in fairy tales you could. Snow White opens her eyes, Sleeping Beauty wakes up. In many versions of Little Red Riding Hood, she emerges from the wolf unscathed, not in all of them, but in many of them. In classical myth, in Western myth, this is not true. Gilgamesh cannot free Enkidu. Theseus cannot free Pirithous. And even Demeter can only bring Persephone back partway, right? And she's a goddess. So these are all stories about, story after story after story about the limits of what you can do when faced with death, and perhaps the limits of what death can do when faced with love. So I wrote this story trying to combine all these stories about love and death into one story and weaving through it with my experiences losing Jenna. I read this story out loud on Hour of the Wolf with. I read this story out loud on Hour of the Wolf, and I was surprised in reading it by how much it still affected me. Not surprised that I still miss Jenna so much. I do. I miss her. I will always miss her. But surprised by how much reading this story brought back of the immediate emotional state of grief and mourning. But also how much this story was related to my realization that fairy tales were going to be the path my life took. I was going to change my focus as an academic and work on fairy tales. I was going to write, really write, right? Not just scribble things down here and now, but here and there, but really write. I remember sending this story, maybe it was a slightly different story, I don't remember, to Kelly Link at the time, and Kelly writing back and saying, I knew you were a writer because you're such a good mimic. I'd written her things in the style of Lemony Snicket and stuff before, and how encouraging that was. So from the last stories, the most recent stories, to the very first stories, these are stories that are about death, about love, about loss, but also about potential. And I think that's what I have to say. I'll see you in Discord.